our country is going insane, and I think David Brooks is the only psychotherapist with any hope of actually curing us. So I'm going to be introducing. So Andrew Marantz will interview David, and if this had been a gathering of journalists, David and Andrew actually would both be good candidates for the Courage Award. So I met Andrew at the TED conference in April, where Andrew gave this amazing talk on the book that he's writing. Where's Andrew? Okay. So I met Andrew just a couple months ago at the TED conference, where he gave this amazing TED talk on his new book called "Antisocial: Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation." So very relevant to our interests, very relevant to everybody who cares about democracy. But he didn't just write about it from a distance. He actually contacted all sorts of trolls, neo-Nazis, racists, and then he went and he actually met with someone. You actually said, like, "Oh, can I see how you do your work?" And he went and he visited them. And there's a particularly funny part in his talk where you see his courage, where here he is interviewing actual Nazis. And he says, he doesn't say this to them, but, "Did you happen to notice anything about my name, my appearance, and my occupation?" So this is real courage to go get those interviews. So Andrew was a great choice, a great journalist to interview David after David's talk. Now for David, David of course needs no introduction, but it's always good to give him more praise. We all love David Brooks. Well, actually, a lot of the world hates you, but that's only the noisy part. The great majority of people love you. Now, David has been eloquent on. I first wrote hundreds of topics, but then I realized, no, you've been writing thousands. He's been eloquent on thousands and thousands of topics. But I just want to pick two to note right now as an introduction to his talk. So the first is the glory of the liberal tradition and a liberal arts education. Nobody could possibly write like David on the range of topics if he did not have a great liberal arts education. I don't just mean the 4 years he spent at the University of Chicago. He couldn't have possibly learned enough just in those 4 years. I mean the habits of heart and mind that have made him a lifelong learner, voraciously interested in ideas wherever they come from, around the world and across the millennia. So I think David is just a beautiful example of what a liberal education can look like. We also heard, interesting this morning, Lynn Pasquarella had this image. I hope I wrote this down correctly. You said a liberal arts education helps students find their best authentic selves. Was that it? Was that what you said? Okay, your best authentic selves. And I think no intellectual working today exemplifies that quest, that lifelong quest, better than David. For those who've been reading him for many years, you know that his writing has turned away from sort of policy wonkery and into really much more issues of heart and soul and development and love. And so I think David has been incredibly courageous and honest and moving in his recent columns in exactly the way that Lynn described. David has also been quite strong in his warnings about what will happen if we give up this liberal tradition, this Western liberal tradition. In an essay called a column called "The Crisis of Western Civilization," he wrote, "These days, the whole idea of Western civ is assumed to be reactionary and oppressive. All I can say is, if you think that was reactionary and oppressive, wait until you get a load of the world that comes after it." The second point on which David has been remarkably eloquent and relevant for this evening is on the value of viewpoint diversity and intellectual humility. There was an interview, you were interviewed at the Aspen Ideas Festival a number of years ago by Katie Kirk, who asked him how we can get to a moderate middle in the country. And David said, well, let me quibble with one phrase in your question, which would be the moderate middle. He says, "So I'm a moderate, but I'm not in the middle. And what I mean by that is I think being moderate is seeing politics as a competition between partial truths. And like in this era, we have competition between security and freedom, between achievement and equality, between mobility and cohesion. And both sides have a piece of the truth. And often you want to be radical on both ends and try to balance. So it's all about balance." Wow. If it turns out someday that scientists discover that reincarnation was true, then I would bet that David Brooks used to be John Stuart Mill. Compare David's statement made off the cuff to this quote from Mill, who said, in almost every one of the leading controversies, past or present, in social philosophy, both sides were in the right in what they affirmed, though wrong in what they denied, and that if either could have been made to take the other's views in addition to its own, little more would have been needed to make its doctrine correct. So I think David Brooks is Exhibit A for anyone trying to make the case for the value of heterodox thinking. And David Brooks, in his breadth, learning, and subtlety of writing, is also Exhibit A for anyone trying to make the case for the value of a broad liberal arts education. And now, here is David on that topic, talking to us about how a university shaped my soul. Please welcome David Brooks.
That was so kind. Thank you, Jonathan. I have felt led by this organization since you founded it, just as a place to go, as a place to follow on Twitter, and as a place, a source of inspiration. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'll talk a little about my career as a pseudo-academic and how universities shaped me and how they can shape people, and sometimes how they don't anymore. I grew up as the child of academics. My father was teaching at NYU. When I was a little kid, we lived in a place called Stuyvesant Town on 14th Street near here. And my parents were somewhat on the left. And in the late 60s, the hippies would go to Central Park and do something called a be-in. They would just go to be. And one of the things they did, they would set a garbage can on fire and throw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5 years old, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, so I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, and grabbed the money and ran away. And that was my first step over to the right, my first heterodoxy. And then when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and decided that instant I wanted to become a writer. And I've been writing pretty much every day since. And the natural thing would have been to go into the academy. I remember in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So those were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And my favorite saying about Chicago, the one everybody knows, which is not true, which is where fun goes to die. But the one I love is, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so that was the atmosphere I was put into. And I totally fell into the atmosphere. I had a double major there in history and celibacy while I was there. And I wrote for the school paper, and I actually had the big break in my career while I was there, which was Bill Buckley came to campus, and I wrote a parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. A really mean parody. It was jokes like, at Yale, Buckley founded 2 magazines, one called the National Buckley, one called the Buckley Review, which he merged to form the Buckley, stuff like that. And he gave a talk to the student body, and at the end of the talk, he said, David Brooks, if you were in the audience, I want to give you a job. And that literally was the big break of my career. Now, sadly, I was not in the audience. I had actually been hired by PBS to go to Stanford to debate Milton Friedman on TV. And so I was then a socialist. I was in my Bernie phrase. And the show, if you go on YouTube, you can actually, if you write in David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you can see a picture of 21-year-old me with this big Jew fro and these gigantic 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory. And I make an argument, Friedman destroys it in about 6 minutes, 6 words, and then the camera lingers on my face for like 20 seconds while I try to think of something to say. That was the show. But then I eventually called Buckley up, and I took him up on the offer. and then had a career sort of in journalism, but I hope on the academic-y end of journalism, sort of little high journalism, low academy. I got a job being the conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca, not a lot of company there, especially after Tierney left over there. And then I got a job on TV, but sort of on the academic-y side of TV. I'm on the NewsHour on PBS, which is as academic as TV gets. I do a segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields, that would have been better. And we appeal to a certain upper middle brow, somewhat elderly audience. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so that's, we're very big in the hospice community. A lot of turnover, unfortunately. And so then I started writing books. And as I've written books, I've tried to be scholarly, but also get more sensitive. I think I've gotten more feminine as my reading has matured. I'm the only American man to finish that book, Eat, Pray, Love, if you know that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which surprised me. And then I wrote this book 4 years ago called A Road to Character. And I learned that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. And so I recommend that. And so that's sort of been my career. And it's been straight up. But as I get older, the thing I appreciate more is the seeds that were planted by my university and the seeds that can be planted by people at a university to change a life forever. And so I went to Chicago back at a time when my Yale colleague Anthony Kronman calls the humanistic ideal was shaping higher ed. And the humanistic ideal is that a university's mission is teleological. It's to shape the character and the souls of the people who go through that. There was a guy in the 1920s named J.F. Roxburgh who worked at the Stowe School where he was headmaster, and he said his job at Stowe was to turn out young men who were acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And I've always admired that as a way to think about changing character. Or as an old Spartan said, I make honorable things pleasant to children. And a lot of what teachers do is they take something excellent and they make it pleasurable to a young person. Now, the humanistic ideal is no longer prevalent in a lot of universities. It is in some, but not in many. And it has been replaced, Kronman says, by the research ideal. And the research ideal has done a lot for us. It's based on the idea of specialized knowledge. These specialized fields down into small bits, and you can expand truth through that. And we've had many great breakthroughs because we have specialized. But, according to Kronman, this emphasis on specialization draws our attention away from the whole of our lives and requires that we focus on small aspects of them itself. Big questions like what makes life get worth living began to seem not only unrealistic, but irresponsible and pernicious, almost unprofessional to ask. My friend and colleague, and actually third cousin, Steven Pinker of Harvard, wrote, I have no idea how to get my students to build a self or become a soul. It isn't taught in graduate school, and in the hundreds of faculty appointments and promotions I've participated in, we've never evaluated a candidate now on how well he or she could do it. And that's a reasonably cogent argument. But my view is if you leave students on their own to do that, with no guidance on the hardest question of life, you're asking for trouble. And schools have no choice but to get in this business. And my professors at Chicago took advantage of this. When I was there were still some refugees from World War II who had escaped Nazi Germany and taught Kant and Hobbes and Thucydides as if the sacred crowns of humanity were contained in these pages, and if you read them well, you would know how to live. And there's a saying, if you catch fire with enthusiasm, people will come for miles to watch you burn. And my professors had that enthusiasm. And I don't remember a lot of what they taught me, but I remember how they approached the books and how seriously they took them. There was a professor named, I'm now forgetting his name, Carl Weintraub. You can see what professors are. And he said, he emailed a friend of mine named Carol Quillen, who now is president of Davidson, and he talked about, it was the end of his life, he said, sometimes when I've spent an hour or more pouring all my enthusiasm and sensitivities into the effort, these stories in the fullness of which I see and experience them, I feel drained and exhausted. I think it works on the student, but I do not really know. And those of us who have prepared passionate lectures or conversations or seminars with students realize that sometimes you pour into the class more than the student is ready to receive, because they're just too young. But I do think you are planting seeds, and I think I'm walking testimony of that, of the seeds that were planted. When I think of what my professors did at Chicago, I think they did 6 things. First, they took us and they welcomed us into a tradition of scholars, a long line of men and women who were in this conversation, a conversation, Michael Oakeshott said, is an endless, unrehearsed intellectual adventure in which in imagination we enter a variety of modes of understanding the world, and ourselves are not disconcerted at all by the differences or dismayed by the inconclusiveness of it all. And we were just little peons in this conversation, but we were entered into it. The second thing they do is they introduced us to the history of the world's moral ecologies. We often tell students, think for yourself, come up with your own worldview. And if your name is Nietzsche or Aristotle, maybe you can do that. The rest of us need help. And so, but we're the lucky inheritors of all these moral ecologies. The classical moral ecology that emphasizes glory and honor, the Hebraic one emphasizing obedience to law and strictness of conscience, the Christian one emphasizing humility, surrender, and grace, the Enlightenment conscious project based on reason, Gnosticism, Buddhism, Confucianism, African animism, Marxism, they're all these inheritances. And they didn't tell you which one to pick, but they said, here they are. See what fits. And that just proved to be tremendously valuable. The third thing they did was they taught us how to see. Now, seeing reality seems like an obvious thing. You open your eyes and you look at the world. But I look at politics, I work in politics, and nobody sees reality clearly. They see the reality they want to see based on their prejudices and their self-interests. Seeing well is not natural. It's an act of humility, and it is taught. It is taught by copying people who know how to see well. Da Vinci, George Eliot, George Orwell, Jane Jacobs, James Baldwin, Leo Tolstoy. You see how they saw. John Ruskin once wrote, the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. Orwell was just a great seer. Tolstoy was a great seer. He has got a scene in Anna Karenina where there's a girl, Kitty, who's going after a ball. He describes what it felt like when she put on her velvet choker, what it felt like when her hair was perfect, her dress was perfect, what it feels like to be an 18-year-old girl who's at the top of her game, what it feels like to see the man she thinks she's going to marry, Vronsky, looking at the ball in rapturous love, and then what it feels like when Vronsky is not looking at her, he's looking at Anna Karenina, and what it feels like to have her whole inside sucked out. And Tolstoy just can see that reality with such clarity and can communicate it. That is such a skill. Fourth, our professors taught us intellectual courage. There's no such thing as thinking for yourself. Even the words we think with are collective things. And most of us don't think for truth, we think for bonding. We want to believe the things that'll make us admitted into the right social circles. And so you have to be taught to go against that and think for truth some of the time. And our professors, by encouraging us to scream at each other in a civil way, encouraged us to seek truth. Fifth, they gave us emotional knowledge. To read Whitman as he exults in joy, to follow Galileo as he follows his discoveries wherever they might lead them, to be with Pascal as he encounters God, or Sylvia Plath as she encounters the depths of madness, is not to have new fact, but is to have had a new experience, and is to have had the repertoire of your emotions widened a little. I once saw Taylor Swift interviewed on 60 Minutes, and somebody said to her, your songs are sad. And Taylor Swift said, well, there are really 22 different kinds of sadness. There's your boyfriend dumps you sadness, and she plays a song. There's you lost your dog sadness, a different song. Your mom is mad at you sadness, a different song. Taylor Swift is an expert at sadness. Who would want to go through life with one kind of sadness or one kind of happiness when you could have 22? And you can only do that by having the experiences that art and emotional wisdom pass along to you. Sixth, Chicago gave us new things to love. And I think this is mostly what universities do. They put love in front of students, things that students find beautiful and they want to follow along. Some of you probably know Plato's Ladder of Loves, where Plato advises when you're teaching the young, put a beautiful face in front of them. And they'll be attracted to a beautiful face, but they'll realize there's even a higher beauty, which is a beautiful personality. And then if you show them a beautiful personality, they'll realize there's an even higher beauty, which is a beautiful society, which is justice. And if they see that beauty, they'll realize there's an even higher beauty, which is truth and the search for truth. And then they'll realize there's a higher beauty still, which is the transcendent beauty of the universe, to which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. And so you walk students up the ladder of loves, and you give them new fields to love, new people to love, and you arouse in them sort of an erotic atmosphere around ideas. I once was sitting in the Regenstein, which is the Library of Chicago, possibly the ugliest building on the face of the earth. And I was reading Nietzsche, and I started at 7, and I woke up, I was reading, but suddenly it was 11. I was not in myself at that moment, I was in the book. And the erotic atmosphere somehow sucked me in. And when you have that kind of experience, it's harder to be shallow and later in life because you've tasted the fine wine and the Kool-Aid just won't do. Rilke said, in the midst of his education, I'm learning to see. I don't know why it is, but everything penetrates more deeply into me and does not stop at the place where until now it used to finish. I have an inner self of which I was ignorant. And the education I think I got introduced us to that inner self. It was somehow very impressive. And then the professors around us did something that urged us to work harder. One of my heroes is the scientist E.O. Wilson. And when Wilson was at Harvard, he had a professor and a mentor named Philip Darlington. And they were both bug scientists. And they collected samples. And Darlington said, don't collect your samples on the path. Cut through the jungle. Do it the hard way, but the right way. And one day Darlington, the legend of Darlington, is that he was in the Amazon on a pond, floating on a log, collecting samples. And a crocodile got up and grabbed him and pulled him down. And he escaped. The crocodile grabbed him again, pulled him down. He escaped a third time. The right side of his body was shredded. He made it back to camp and back to safety. But as Wilson says or wrote, that's not what impressed him about Darlington. Anybody can get out of a crocodile. What impressed him was that in a body cast with his right arm immobilized, he taught himself to go back into the jungle and collect his samples left-handed with one hand. And he did that for months. And that's what people want from their professors. They want to be taught that something is hard and it is worthy of hardness. Students don't want happiness, they want intensity. And so that's what you can get at a university, just an expansion. Now, do we give that all the time? I think a lot of the times we don't. And we don't help the students in the years after college. The students are so spiritually hungry. My students, the students at every college I go, and they want to know what is the highest and best life. And we hand them a bunch of great empty boxes a lot of the time. The first empty box we hand them is freedom. We tell them you should be free. Freedom leads to happiness. We give you your liberated self. Freedom doesn't help them define what the best life is. They got plenty of freedom. So then we hand them another big box of nothing, possibility. Your future is limitless. You can do anything you want. Be audacious. Take risks. Don't be afraid to fail. How does it help them to tell them things are limitless? How does that help them define what their best life is? So we give them another empty box, the box of authenticity. Look inside yourself. Find your true inner passion. You're amazing. Awaken the giant within. You do you. That doesn't help them either. The you is the thing that isn't formed yet. So we give them the biggest and emptiest box of all, the box of autonomy. You're on your own. It's up to you to find your own values. No one else can tell you what's right or wrong for you. Do what you love. And they're cast out in the world without any guidance. And a lot of my students are great students. They got into Yale, but they wander. And some of them wander into what Kierkegaard called an aesthetic life. They want to have life as a series of adventures, which is where each adventure is fun. And they measure their life by aesthetic criteria. Is it interesting? Is it boring? And that's great for them for a little while. But eventually they get bored of it because it's not accumulating into anything. Others lead a life of what a writer named Matthias Dahlgaard called an insecure overachiever. They want to solve the problem of insecurity, and Goldman or McKinsey tells them junior year, we know what you're going to do for the next 3 years. So their heart may not be in it, but they go into Goldman because they're good at getting into things. So they treat life as an extension of school. They just get into prestigious brands. And then they follow that life, and pretty soon the deepest questions of life, which used to animate them in college, get replaced by the shallower questions of how do I succeed? And you can let drop those spiritual questions that used to obsess you, and you become a little more of a shrewd animal. As Dahlgaard says, you have a problem in the foundation of your life, and you think you can solve it by building a shiny new story up on top. And eventually, whether it's the aesthetic life or whether it's the insecure overachiever life, they hit a sort of valley, a psychological valley. Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. If you don't know your why, when the setbacks come, you begin to crumble. And I get them, and maybe you do too, from the students a few years later, and their tone of voice is so different, they've been hit by a mental health problem. And their confidence is shot. And they're in a telos crisis. They don't know what their telos is. And I had a friend named Casey Gerald who was getting interviewed for a job, and instead of just answering questions, he asked the interviewer a question, and it was a very good question. What would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying, because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company if she wasn't afraid. And so one of the reasons mental health and depression rates are up is for the reasons Jonathan cited, which is the phones and everything else and the coddling. But I think a lot of it is a spiritual crisis. My old professor, Alan Bloom, said everything is relative on campus, and it creates men without chests. It creates a sort of bourgeois blandness. I think that turns out to have been wrong. And Hannah Arendt was more right when she said that all forms of fanaticism come from existential anxiety. If you're existentially anxious, you don't turn into a boring last man, you turn into a fanatic and a nut. And that's because you're trying to find some way to belong. The psychologists have a phrase, the hardest thing to cure is the patient's attempt to self-cure. And the attempted self-cure of loneliness is tribalism. Tribalism seems like community, but in fact, it's the opposite of community. Community is based on a mutual love for something, your town, your school. Tribalism is based on a mutual hatred of something, some other. And so it's always friend-enemy distinctions, us, them, scarcity mindset, build walls, erect barriers. And you get the tribalism that flows out of a spiritual void. And we see a lot of that in politics and a lot of that on campus. And so that's the problem put before us. The solutions will come from people like in this room who are willing to engage the deepest issues in the deepest ways. The solutions will come from the spiritual hunger, which never goes away. One of my students who unfortunately died at a tragically young age, I remember we had coffee once, his name was John Haratunian, and he leaned over to me and said, "We're so hungry." The spiritual hunger is so palpable. And then the final reason the students will come was a kind of heterodoxy I see in students where I visit all around the country. And it's in their backgrounds. And you probably have these students, they've got all these weird backgrounds. They're like part French, they're part Costa Rican. They've just come from all these diverse places, and they don't only admire pluralism, they embody pluralism. They have all these completely different backgrounds. They were the Syrian who wound up in a community college in Ohio, a woman who grew up in a Baptist home in Alabama, now a first-generation college student in an Ivy League school. They transcend worlds. And they don't only admire heterodoxy, they are heterodox. I could come to think of them as amphibians. And we talk about the fragility of the young, and that's true. But a lot of the students that we all have made e pluribus unum their life mission. because they've taken so many opposites in their background and they've created something special in themselves. And their heterodoxy, their respect for bridging capital, their respect for finding narratives that give an integrity to a diverse life are some of the things that are going to lead us out of the craziness that John described. Thank you.
Very nice. So we're going to talk for a few minutes now. And we're going to see if we have time at the end for questions, hopefully. But only a few, so they have to be really good ones. Yeah, I was very interested in your remarks. I have no way of relating to what you said about double majoring in celibacy and spending hours in the library with Nietzsche, but I can imagine, nor can I relate to having a Jufro and thick glasses. It's all like Greek to me, but I can...
You were the Erica Jong at your college.
Exactly, that's right.
A reference nobody gets under
yeah.
40.
I actually fly all the time. But but what you said about Nietzsche is interesting because I wonder if there's a tension between, okay, so you're spending all these kind of hours in the thrall of Nietzsche, right? Being in the thrall of Nietzsche has caused a lot of problems in history, right? So the question then is, how should a university, we're talking a lot about the problems of certain ways of setting up guardrails and certain ways of shutting down conversation, and yet there are certain ideas that deserve to be shut down in the developing brain. So I guess it's a broad question, but how do you think a university should go about putting up those guardrails so that truly bad things don't happen?
Well, some people pass the test of time. Nietzsche is problematic in some ways and brilliant in some ways. He's just tremendously complicated. And if you can't deal with people, teach students to deal with complicated thinkers, then how are they going to deal with every other human being in their life who's going to be extremely complicated? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is wrong with our politics and along with the academy is just poor seeing of other human beings. C.S. Lewis had a line that if you had never met a human being before and you met one, you'd be inclined to worship this creature because we're so deep and complicated. And to see people at their full depths is an act of complexity and then an act of humility that when you first meet somebody, you haven't seen them at their full depths. So it seems to me seeing a thinker like Nietzsche is actually a very good example of seeing someone who is very problematic and very off-putting in a lot of ways and very brilliant. And one of the things I used to tell the conservative students on campus was that you may think your politics are more sophisticated than your professors, but they know their field a lot more than you do. And so have some respect for that, which is a hard lesson to teach.
Mm. And how does that mesh the notion of conservative students having respect for their professors or whatever the sort of grain of that is? How does that mesh with your kind of concerns about the Great Awakening as you or the kind of the topic of discussion here? I mean, how do you balance sort of having respect for a discipline with also kind of having deep doubts about that discipline?
Well, it's easy to demonize the Awakening, and a lot of people do. But, I did this piece maybe 15, 20 years ago called The Organization Kid about Princeton. And it was about how students never challenged their professors. Well, we're over that. And I think that's, on balance, a good thing. I think it's David Foster Wallace in that famous Kenyan address said, there's no atheists in life, we all worship something. And some of the spiritual yearnings come out as a political radicalism that can take a fanatical form, but it does grow out of a spiritual yearning and a yearning to do good. Mm-hmm. And so that, to me, is actually a good sign. And sort of the most worst student is just the materialistic, inert one, not the one who's screaming at you. They're at least alive. And so, I think that there was a daycare center in Israel. John knows this study, I'm sure. The parents were coming in late. And so in order to cure the lateness, because the teachers wanted to go home, they fined the parents who came in late. And the number of people who came in late doubled. And that's because they took what had been a moral decision to show up on time for the sake of the relationship with the teacher, and they turned it into an economic transaction. And for a little while, in a lot of our schools, we take what should be a a relational or a spiritual thing, the quest for knowledge, and we turn it into an economic decision. And we morally numb. We take off the moral lens. But now the moral lens is fully alive on campus. And I think on balance we should be deeply appreciative of that, and that the students are finally feeling free to do that. All my life I've wanted a kid to come up to me and say, you know, I wanted to major in accounting, but my parents are forcing me to major in art history. And that'll never happen, because it's always the kids who have the spiritual yearnings and the parents who want to damp that down. But now the spiritual yearning is coming out.
And so that's interesting. So I mean, on the one hand, we are at Heterodox Academy, so one would think that we'd be talking about the downsides of this. On the other hand, we're at Heterodox Academy, so I would like you to feel free to disagree. But so do you see this as a problem? This campus, I mean, do you see the campus climate stuff as a major sort of crisis that we're facing in relation to all the other crises that you lay out in your work, or how do you see it stacking up against the relational crises you lay out, the political crises, the environmental crises?
Yeah, I think it's part of the crisis of connection. I was at Yale when the Halloween thing happened. And the next term, I had a kid from Rice in my seminar. He was at the law school, but he was taking my class. And he said, I've never been to a place where everybody's so afraid. After that, a bunch of students came up to me and said, yeah, we agree. But they wouldn't say it in public, because everything had been tamped down. And frankly, what worries me is not, speakers get deplatformed or whatever you call it. What worries me is how rough they are on each other.
The students.
The students. So if they could see a possibility of getting the moral one-upsmanship, they seize that possibility. One of my students told me that a moral craze will sweep through campus, and if she doesn't post on Facebook within 6 hours, it's noticed. And so she has to be alert to that. I run this program at the Aspen Institute called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. So it's called Weave. And a woman from the University of Pennsylvania, one of our interns, came up with a name. And another student from MIT, instead of saying, let's check this out, she said, you've obviously never met a black person, because they will all be offended by that name, Weave. And it was a good objection, but she phrased it in the most brutally punishing way of accusing her of being a racist. And so she took the opportunity to do the one-upsmanship. And there's somehow it's gotten into the atmosphere that the way you prove you're a good person is not by showing compassion and care, but by denouncing.
Well, I think we all know David's wrong about all that, and that he's a bad person for. You have sort of referred to yourself as a Burkean, an American Whig, a moderate sort of politically, and I guess in many vectors. Do you think? I mean, you mentioned this kind of moral awakening, this whatever the opposite of inertness is. Do you feel that there are times when moving slowly is the wrong approach? That and sort of how do you, as someone who has that temperament, sort of react to those situations?
Yeah. So Burkeans so much believe in context; they're not Burkean in all contexts. Right. And by the way, I got to Chicago, and we had very little control over the first 2 years of what we were going to study. And as a result, they were my best 2 years. My last 2 years, I picked all the wrong courses. I made horrible mistakes. And one of the classes I was assigned this book, The Reflections in the Revolution of France. And I was a radical, and I believed in thinking for yourself and the power of reason. And here was this guy saying the power of reason is weak, and we should follow our just prejudice and the things that stood the test of time. And I wrote 6 or 10 papers on what a complete idiot Edmund Burke was. And I'm so glad I was forced to read him, and so glad he touched something that really made me angry. And it was that hot spot that I should have paid attention to. And later, after I was a police reporter in Chicago, I came to think, oh, he's right. But so there are times when your foundation is basically sound, where you, as he says, you should do change that is incremental but constant, and you should operate on society the way you would operate on your father. So with a great deal of care. But there are some times when the foundations of a system are not fundamentally sound, and then you can't operate by Burke. And frankly, I think the healthcare system is sort of like this. Like the incentives are screwed up at the foundation. And so you have to think radically about those cases. And so sometimes gradualism nothing's right in all contexts. I'm another fan of Michael Oakeshott, And Oakeshott said that politics is just always balance. You just ship. If the ship's over here, you go over this way. If the ship's over here, you always go over this way. And everything is so heavily contextually driven. And then finally, while I was in Chicago, I think I read or wrote 600,000 papers on Thucydides. Or one paper 600,000 times. But one of the lessons of the Peloponnesian War is that in politics, the lows are lower than the highs are high. So when politicians screw up, it's a disaster. When they do something great, it's a modest gain. And so you should be careful about screwing up because things can go really south really fast.
Yeah, well, and I guess two other examples that come to mind in addition to healthcare where things are sort of, one could argue sort of screwed up at the root. One would be the environmental crisis. I mean, it seems that there's a kind of good argument to be made for incivility on that front. So, I mean, I guess that's my question. Do you see that as a challenge to, when people are storming into Dianne Feinstein's office and being highly incivil or uncivil, I don't know which one it is. Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, I just don't think it works. Like, people always say we need to hit them harder. Like, when have you ever been persuaded by being hit harder? I get persuaded when I meet somebody I think is really admirable. I get persuaded by somebody who seems to be reasonable and seems like an admirable person and thinks that. And I get persuaded by pleasure. When, the best way to be a good conservative is to be an enjoyable person. And it gives credibility to your cause. And I've never been persuaded by incivility. I actually had a friend over at my house and we were talking about reparations. I'm pro-reparations.
Now,
not always, but now I am. Though I really admire you. Okay. So she said to me, I was saying somehow she saw an Abraham Lincoln book on my bookshelf. And we were agreeing on everything. And then she said to me, I think Abraham Lincoln was guilty of worse genocide than Adolf Hitler. And she was talking about Lincoln's treatment of the Native Americans. And she didn't know her history. Like, Native American policy was terrible, but it was terrible before Lincoln, it was terrible after Lincoln. He was busy with the Civil War. But I felt this white-hot heat, and I would have disagreed with her about everything at that moment. And so just as a matter of persuasion, we talk about, like, going into war, it's good to hit them harder. Going into conversation, is it really good to hit them harder? I don't think I've ever been persuaded by getting hit in the face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as a persuasive tactic, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was going to bring up reparations. There's so many things to say about it, and not on a sort of meta level more than sort of arguing out the point. But what was it like to change your mind in public in that way? I mean, that is sort of the most heterodox thing you can do, is argue with yourself in that way. And I'm sure you've done it many times, but this is a way you framed that argument as being a convert to the cause.
Yeah.
How did that sort of come about as the thing you wanted to do, and how did that sort of feel to do that publicly?
Let me describe one other change of heart, which was harder. I was a supporter of the Iraq War, and then round about 2007, I realized that wasn't a really good idea. And so I had sleepless nights, real torture, and I finally wrote a really confessional column of what I got wrong. And what I learned at that moment was that when you convert in that way, your friends feel betrayed and your enemies feel emboldened. And they seize upon your vulnerability and they attack you for it. And so there's a reason why politicians never admit error. It's not because they don't know they haven't committed errors, but it's a total killer from both sides. Yeah. And I would say that was slightly true with the reparations thing as well.
Was it?
That my conservative friends were upset with me, and I got some strange new respect, but it doesn't win you over. And it's weird, Jonathan mentioned sort of the controversy. When my first 6 months on the job at the Times were like the worst of my professional life, because I'd never been hated on a mass scale before. And there were I deleted my emails after 6 months, and there were 290,000. And the core message of them was that Paul Krugman is great, you suck. and I just read some research on this. Who writes in those comments? They're not sociopaths. They're emotionally very intelligent people. They just don't care if they hurt you. And so what I found about the commenters was that they critiqued me very effectively on exactly the things I was most insecure about. My hairline, stuff like that. And so they were super effective, and I just had to shade myself from that. The weird thing is that I've gotten more moderate over the years, and the hatred against me has ratcheted up. And I don't exactly understand it. And I don't know if the times have changed, or maybe the vulnerability lets you in for more. And I read about morality more, so I can be a self-righteous prig. I get that.
Or maybe it's that you were just mentioning email, but email is nothing compared to Twitter. So
that's true.
So is there any way to turn that into criticism that you ever see or find useful, or do you tune it all out? Or
yeah. So at first I read everything because I thought I should learn, and then I got so depressed, and so I made my assistant read it, and then he got depressed. It's like, and so now I forget what I wrote. I just wrote something that I can't remember. It's my last column. I can't remember it, but it was trending on Twitter. I was getting a lot of hate, and because I'm a boomer, I don't know how to turn off the push notifications, and my phone is just. So you have to learn to distance, and you have to think, do I really believe this? But it's easier to have that than to actually go into a workplace on a campus and have people be in your face with hostility.
The answer to your question of what was the last column you wrote is the Calcasieu column. Yeah. But I bring that up because it's a university-based thing. And so I guess, I'll sort of end with this, and if anybody has just a couple of questions we only have time for. But, I was thinking about that column when you were speaking, because you were talking about the ways in which universities are at present deficient at soul creation. In fact, Harvard was the example you gave. And this is a kid who was rescinded admission from Harvard. And so the question to my mind is, you were arguing that well, you can say what you were arguing, but basically that Harvard erred in rescinding the admission. And I guess my question is, if we're at a position where universities are not in a position to give a moral education to people who have morally erred, where does that leave us in terms of, does that complicate things in terms of how you curate your student body, or where is the onus in that situation?
Yeah, well, if colleges don't do it, then somebody will have to do it. And either they'll find faith, but that doesn't seem to happen, or they'll find that the statistics are that if you ask young people, are you spiritual, do you pray? The same number of young people pray as ever before. There's been no decline in faith. If you ask them, do you pray around other people? There's been a collapse of that. So they pray alone, and they create their own religion, which is easy on them, because that religion always tells them what they're doing is right. But it leads to a disjointed spirituality, which frankly would not be as religious, or not be as rigorous and as deep as if they sort of inherited a church or a synagogue or a mosque, even though we all know organized religion is frustrating. The second point to be made about that column, the core of the column was, when you're measuring a kid's academic expertise or excellence, every A is a good thing, every D is a bad thing. But in moral development, it's not like that. The Ds are very good, because they're moments of sin and opportunities for redemption. You don't learn much from your moral A's, but you learn a lot from your moral D's. And so I was objecting to the imposition of academic expertise onto moral formation. And I will say the one thing I believe is that the meritocracy, which we've taken as the water in which we swim, I think is about to be, and is in the midst of being, massively challenged. The argument that I've found very compelling is that the meritocracy is great for spurring achievement, but it contains lies that we've accepted for too long, and the cost of those lies has increased. And some of the lies are career success will create fulfillment and happiness. And I'm the poster child for that not being true. Second lie is that I can make myself happy, that happiness is an individual thing. I see the lie in some of my students is that I can earn love. That love is something you earn by achievement, and a lot of my students are caught in the grip of conditional love. And then the final lie, which we pretend not to tell, but we really do, is that accomplished people are worth a little more than everybody else. And if you want to drive a society insane, tell them that. And so this is all embedded in our higher university system. I was just at Arizona State University, and they said everybody else increases their prestige by excluding people. We include, and there's some truth to that shift. And excluding people is just, you're going to drive people crazy.
Yep. I thank you for that. I would like to have, if there's anyone with like the best question ever, we'll just take a couple. If not, that's all right.
So we've ruled out anybody with intellectual humility, right there.
Yes, exactly. No, it has to be. Well, put it this way: it has to be a question. Yeah.
Well, first I have it easy because I'm not a real academic. I teach from the outside, so I don't have a research agenda. I don't have any committee assignments. I'm not writing references. So I'm only there for the students. That's the only reason I'm there. And so that's my sole focus, and that's where my time is. My office hours, I'm there. I teach one class on Monday. I'm there overnight Monday night, and then I teach another class on Tuesday. And so my office hours, the only time I have them, it's in a bar between 9:30 and 1 in the morning on Monday night. That's literally where they are. And the class, my students call it Therapy with Brooks, because they get to spill their guts. And I basically teach them a series of books that I hope will change their lives. Some of them are like Man's Search for Meaning, or Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness, just books like that. And I teach them about, the course is really called The Four Commitments. It's based on the idea that most college students will make 4 big decisions, some of 4 big decisions over the next 15 years, to a vocation, to a marriage, to a philosophy or faith, and to a community. How do you make the big decisions in life? And my students all want to talk about vocation. How do I make that decision? I want to teach them about the marriage decision. And they don't want to think about that. They say, marriage is a box that'll come in the mail when I'm 35. I'm like, no, start thinking about it. Like, read Joy. I tell college students it's the most important decision you make. So every college class should be about how to decide who to marry. Like the sociology of marriage, the neuroscience of marriage, nobody takes my advice. It's very good advice, by the way. And then I ask them, I take any reading in our class and apply it to a problem in your own life. And most of them pick Dorothy Day, by the way. They love, religious or not, they love Dorothy Day. And some of them will write about living in the hookup culture. A guy wrote about how shitty he was to his girlfriend, based on Augustine's Confessions. They really are willing to lay bare these psychological problems that they're going through. The final thing I'll say on that is that in the middle of one of my terms about 3 years ago, I was wooing a woman trying to get her to marry me. And she decided to come up to New Haven to give me an answer. And I said to the students, tonight I'm going to have to cancel office hours. I'm dealing with a personal issue. I'm just got to deal with that. I didn't say anything else. That was it. And that night, of the 25 students, 19 or so sent me an email saying, just want you to know I'm thinking of you, I'm praying for you. And it changed the tenor of the course for the rest of the term. Just that little bit of vulnerability that suggested I was not Professor Brooks, but I was just another schmo trying to get through life. That vulnerabilities, we're not supposed to do that as professors. But I found it really helped the class. And she came and told me that she could never marry me. And now we're married, so.
All right, well.
We have to end on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, this concludes our program for the evening. I think we've had an extraordinary day. We opened the day with a framing talk from Lynn Pasquarella, giving us a sense of what universities are, what they could be, and what problems we're facing. We then went on to this amazing session on diversity, which is really one of the most important issues that we have to address, chaired by Jamal. We had a lot of practical ideas from that, and a lot of humor too, thanks to Kareth and others. We then had our dinner here. We honored six courageous and important honorees who are working to improve higher education. And then we just heard what I think is the best academic stand-up routine I have ever seen. Followed by the best talk on the possibilities and hopes of the Academy that I have ever seen. And David, you are on fire, and we are all so lucky and grateful that we got to watch you without even having to travel. So thank you for that extraordinary talk. So.